Okay. We should be live. We are live now, folks. Ready to go.
Thank you. Okay, let's get started. Thank you, everyone who is joining us today for this live virtual session we have billed as On the Brink, How Our Democracy Almost Died. It is based around the 2018 book, How Democracies Die. We're sure these next 60 minutes are going to go by very, very fast. So please stay muted if you are joining us via Zoom. Our chat box is open for questions, which we hope we can spare some time for near the end of the session. This session is also being recorded at the Healdsburg Tribune YouTube channel for live streaming right now and for later viewing. Introducing the panel and helping us get started, Lowell Bergman. Raise your hand, Lowell. There he is in that little rectangle. Lowell joins us once again for a session as he enjoys what he calls retirement after a 50-year career as a prize-winning investigative journalist, University of California, Berkeley professor at the Graduate School of Journalism, and as a producer of many documentaries and investigative projects. Lowell's career has taken him to many places around the world and through past decades where despots, tyrants, dictators, and corporate crooks threaten numerous democracies. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Lowell is splitting his time between homes in Berkeley and Freestone in Western Sonoma County. Where are you tonight, Lowell?
In Sonoma County. I haven't moved since the first week of March.
Smart guy. Lowell is actually a close neighbor to our other panelist, Daniel Ziblatt, whose child home is quite near in Occidental. I think they share a zip code, and Daniel's parents still live there. Professor Ziblatt is the current Eaton Professor of the Science of Government at Harvard University and the co-author, along with fellow Professor Stephen Levitsky, of the 2018 book, How Democracies Die. Professor Ziblatt also chairs the seminar on democracy, past, present, and future at the Minda de Ginsberg Center for European Studies. He's the author of several books on European politics, economies, and governments, and the history of generally of democracy. He's also been a visiting professor at several universities in Europe. We're very grateful that Professor Ziblatt, Daniel, for the rest of the evening, has agreed to join us for this most timely examination of the state of America's democracy. Who knew back before our November 3rd election, when Daniel and I first agreed to do this virtual visit to his native Sonoma County, how incredibly timely a talk about how democracies die would prove to be. Here, just 22 days after the violent attack on our nation's capital on January 6th. Well, here we are. To lead our conversation and examination of the many historical facts and prescient analysis included in How Democracies Die is El Molino history and journalism teacher, John Grech. John, raise your hand, please. Okay. You know, I'm glad Greg Jacobs didn't try to take your place. That's good. So there's John. Here comes our panel. Just before we get started, I just know our time's going to be really constrained. We want to get into as much detail as possible. But first, I want to save some time and introduce Nancy Dobbs, our board president of the Sonoma County Local News Initiative, to add a few more welcome remarks and thank you. So Nancy, are you ready?
Thanks, Raleigh. Thank
Absolutely.
you. And welcome to certainly to our esteemed guests and also to all of y'all who are joining us today. Before we get started, we want to acknowledge and thank our sponsors, starting with Levin and Company, a bookstore in Healdsburg. They have laid on extra copies of Daniel's book so that if you want to pick one up, you can do it there. And you can also talk to them about getting it autographed. In addition, the Sonoma County Library has stocked extra e-editions of the book. And the Sonoma County Office of Education very kindly sent out a special announcement to all of the school districts in the county, as well as to history teachers. So we are hopeful that there are a lot of students joining us here today. And we, of course, also want to thank our good friends at NorCal Public Media for promoting the event today. We're all, of course, really mindful of the critical and central role that journalism plays in sustaining and informing a democracy. I suspect that's why many of us are, in fact, here today. So the Sonoma County Local News Initiative has been established to assure the success of our local journalism through the Sonoma West publishers. We aim to support strong local journalism, community engagement, and media literacy. So we ask today, while you're listening to the conversation and discussion, which I know is going to be fascinating, that you very seriously consider financially supporting the work of the Local News Initiative. It is really only with support from our community, from all of us together, that is going to assure us success. It will assure the broadening and the deepening of the news, the local news, as well as support a number of local news, new initiatives that we're launching, such as one to provide journalism education to local high school students in conjunction, of course, with our local high schools. So please do consider support. There's so many important ways, as we stop to think about it, that democracy is supported by journalism and journalism is supported by you. You can find us at socolocalnews.org. I know we're all looking forward to a very provocative conversation, so let's get to it, Raleigh.
Thank you. So once again, thanks to Lowell and Daniel for joining us, and we'll turn this floor over to Professor Grech.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Professor Daniel Ziblatt and Mr. Lowell Bergman, for letting me be a part of this. I've just been excited about this. What struck me about your book, Daniel, was the fascinating interplay of democracy and authoritarianism. And it struck me how vulnerable democracy really can be. And I feel like in the United States, throughout our history, we've sort of taken democracy for granted, and maybe wrongfully so. Could you break down for us your definition of authoritarian behavior and how it can weaken and even destroy democracy?
Yeah, thank you. Well, first, thank you everybody for coming tonight, and thanks for the opportunity to talk to you all. And I wish I could be in green Sonoma County. Instead, I'm in very white Boston, Massachusetts right now. So, so really nice to be here virtually. So, yeah, John, great question. I think one way of thinking about this is, when I teach my students about authoritarianism, I just finished an online class this evening. I show images often of tanks rolling down the streets, a kind of siege of the Parliament building. I just showed a clip this evening of Argentina in 1976 or Spain in 1981 when there are these violent takeovers of government. And that is the way that democracies die. But increasingly, since the end of the Cold War, it's much more common for democracies to die in ways that are much more subtle at the ballot box. Politicians, prime ministers getting elected, assaulting democratic institutions in subtle ways, so the parliament continues to meet, the constitution remains intact, elections continue to happen, and so it's harder to see what is happening. I mean, sometimes we have these vivid events like we saw on January 6th, but that's a kind of peak event, and most of the time you see a kind of decay happening. And so then the question becomes, well, how do you recognize it? And that's really what your question is about. And so it's really important to be alert to this. And so one thing that we, in writing our book, drew upon was this wonderful little book by a Spanish political scientist named Juan Linz, who identified anti-democratic behavior among politicians before they get elected. And that's what we drew upon. And so just to give you some of the indicators, things that should set off alarm bells. And at this point, we're all kind of old hands at this, unfortunately. If you don't accept if a politician doesn't respect the rules of the game, so suggest they might not accept the results of election. At one point, that would be a shocking thing to say that a politician would do that, but now we know that that has happened. If politicians don't distance themselves from actors in society that use violence, so they don't explicitly and unambiguously condemn violence and distance themselves from violence, that's also another warning sign. If you have politicians who challenge the legitimacy of their opponents, in some way say that their opponents have, in some way, are like criminal or ought not be running for office or have no legitimacy to run for office, this should also be a warning sign. And then finally, the fourth major kind of check mark that one can kind of look at is whether or not politicians attack the civil liberties of citizens, including the media, above all the media. And so if you see a politician do any of these things, this political scientist Juan Linz warned back in 1978, you should be worried. And so, what was so striking, I think, back in 2016 was that it was pretty clear that we were going to face some challenges. A lot of people at the time said, well, this is all talk, just pay attention to the action. I think it turns out that politicians that often are as authoritarian as advertised, and that's what we've witnessed over the last 4 years.
So we're going to get to these current politicians in this conversation soon. But another thing that struck me was that our Constitution, when you look at it, it's very brief. As you point out again and again throughout the book with different examples, it has huge loopholes where you're relying on the goodwill, if you will, of politicians to keep those guardrails of democracy sort of safe, that those guardrails are sort of easy to violate. So my question on the US Constitution is, how do we go about reforming it? Are we too attached to it as it is? Is it too difficult to reform? It's alarming how many avenues there are for democracy to sort of fall apart. So before we get to the media and all these other players, what about the Constitution itself?
Yeah, so we have the oldest written continuous constitution in the world. And so that's something that is a good thing. I mean, constitutional stability is in general, I would say, a good thing. But the downside of this is that we have a very old constitution. And so we have a constitution that was written, it's as you say, a brief document, but there's these major gaps in our constitution. It comes as a shock sometimes to people that our constitution doesn't mention the word political party, because political parties didn't exist when our constitution was written. And, it's kind of remarkable to think we now have a political system totally centered around political parties. And so to have a constitution without a mention of parties is kind of a remarkable thing, and just shows you the ways in which there are gaps. All rules, as we all know in our daily lives, have loopholes. I mean, you can't design any system that doesn't rely on some form of good behavior. But when you have a constitution that's very brief, then it just allows more room for discretion. And so that's why in our book, what we argue is that, our constitution relies on a lot of unwritten rules, and those have developed over time. And one particular of self-restraint. The politicians can't use the institutions to the max, or else we're going to get in trouble. And so, so that's a gap. We've kind of filled in the Constitution. All of the constitutional amendments over time have 14th Amendment, the 13th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, to guarantee equality across the United States. And so these things have made a major difference, but nonetheless, we haven't changed our Constitution very much. And in some ways, the most fundamental weakness of our Constitution, and some people at points have thought it's a strength, is that it's so difficult to amend. You need 2/3 of the House and the Senate, president to sign, and then 3/4 of the states to sign off on any constitutional change. And so this just makes it incredible, the barriers, and actually, people, social scientists have studied around the world different constitutions and the ease of changing the Constitution. We have a Constitution that's very hard to change. And so, we can get into like the reforms that I think we ought to adopt. But in many ways, the kind of short version of it is essentially, whereas many countries in the post-1945 period have really stamped out kind of traces of old counter-majoritarian elements. So, the House of Lords, for instance, in Britain, have made that institution quite weak. We continue to operate with this very antiquated constitution. And to me, I think that's one of the major areas of challenges, how to, given the difficulty of reforming it, to figure out a way of either circumventing that or of building the coalitions necessary to reform a constitution.
Would a third party help? Political party?
Well, maybe. I mean, I think it's, that would help a lot of things. I think having a third political party would reduce the levels of polarization, I think, in our society. And so, but there's a set of rule changes that need to take place in order to allow a third party to exist. I mean, the reason we don't have a third party in the United States is not that our society is not diverse enough and there's not enough a range of opinions to support a third party. It's just that the way our elections are set up, again, not described in our Constitution. We have single member districts for our Congress where whoever gets the most vote wins that seat. And so the cross-national evidence, again, as a political scientist speaking here, is very clear. When you have that kind of election system that we have, instead of a proportional system, the rules determine the number of parties. It's pretty straightforward. And so there's a lot of effort underway to introduce ranked order voting in some states. And this all has to happen, by the way, at the state level, not at the national level, because our system is set up so that the states determine their own election systems. And so Maine has introduced ranked order voting. A proposal and a referendum in Massachusetts just failed this past year. But these are the kinds of reforms at the state level that if you changed those rules, then you would get more political parties. And then this would lead to maybe additional reforms and a change in our political system down the road.
So, another theme running through your book that maybe our Constitution encourages or tolerates is that polarization has risen and fallen throughout American history. And you argue in the book really convincingly that polarization is sort of like a symptom or a precursor to democracy weakening and falling apart. What are the reasons that America has gotten so polarized this go around? And of course, I'm thinking about pre-Civil War polarization, Great Depression polarization. In this go around, what do you see as the root cause? Because clearly this precedes Donald Trump.
Yes, it does precede Donald Trump, and it's quite complex. I mean, this is one of the naughtiest, meaning difficult to unwind questions facing our society, I think, today. And it's clearly making it hard for our government to function, first of all. I mean, it's hard to just address basic problems like distributing vaccines, for instance, and passing a stimulus bill in the face of an economic crisis. And it also increases the level of animosity among citizens. And so that citizens fear and loathe each other across party divides now. And so, the question of what's driving this is there's a lot of factors at work. A scholarship seems to suggest that there's a couple of different factors that matter the most. My read of it is that a lot of this is driven by demographic and cultural changes that have happened in the United States. In particular, what's really happened over the last 40, 50 years is we've had a kind of clustering of what used to actually, although we have a two-party system, we have Democrats and Republicans, for a long time within each of those parties, you had two different factions. So you had conservative Democrats in the US South, liberal Democrats, mostly in the North. In the Republican Party, you had conservative Republicans, often in the Midwest, and liberal Republicans, often in the Northeast. And so you had these four factions clustered across these two parties. And what that meant was that the gap between the two parties wasn't as great. And so you just look at Congress, it was a lot easier for conservative, for ill and for good. So conservative Democrats could get together with Republicans and forge deals. Liberal Republicans and liberal Democrats could forge deals. What's happened, though, over time is the two parties have become much more homogeneous themselves. So the Republican Party now is entirely based mostly in rural areas, non-urban areas. You've sort of lost urban Republicans. And the Democratic Party is primarily a party of urban areas. And so you have two very different parties representing two very different demographics, and race certainly plays a major role in this. The Republican Party is 90% white and Christian. The Democratic Party is highly diverse. And when you have these kind of clustering taking place, it's much easier to hate the other side. So that's a long answer, and I haven't even answered the second part of the question, which is why has that happened? But maybe I'll stop there because I'm sure you have another question.
Well, you bring up in the book several times that a lot of that consensus that sort of was featured in American politics through our history was really based on exclusion. And you mentioned race, in what you're just saying, and I wonder if if you agree with me, that it remains to be seen if our democracy can survive a truly inclusive political system where people of color have their vote counted, where the Electoral College represents the actual votes, where gerrymandering is minimized. It seems like we've never gotten there. We still have a long way to go. Are you optimistic that democracy? It's an ironic question because the definition of democracy is inclusive. Are you optimistic, though, that with the Democratic Party being more inclusive and the Republican Party being less exclusive, and this polarization, can our country come together maybe stronger than ever?
Well, yeah, I don't know about that, but I'll tell you what I am optimistic about is that there has been a massive change, and we, all of us are sitting here probably depressed about the state of the world, somewhat optimistic about the, Biden administration, but on the other hand, kind of looking out at the world, thinking that there's a lot going wrong. And I think that's right. But, I'll tell you one thing that is worth recognizing, and that is that at a very general level, mass attitudes towards race have become much more liberal in the United States, despite the rise of white nationalism. And if you look at public attitudes on race from 1968 to today, American society is much more inclusive. So you look at attitude. So, in 1968, Richard Nixon sort of carried out the strategy to try to, use violence and unrest in the cities to try to win over his silent majority. And it worked. Donald Trump tried to do the same thing in 2020, and it didn't work. And the reason it didn't work, one big reason, is that mass attitudes have changed. And if you look at attitudes after the rise of Black Lives Matter in the spring and this summer, at least for now, people are much, in reaction to all of that, people have become much more inclusive, including whites. Whites have become much more racially inclusive in their attitudes. And so in fact, I think given demographic changes, given shifting attitudes of whites, there are pretty clear majorities at this point in this country that are inclusive, that are liberal. And the problem in some ways is not the people. The problem are the rules of our constitutional system that don't allow that majority to speak. And so the fact that Republicans have governed the presidency for 12 of the last 20 years, although they have only won the presidency, the popular vote, once, tells you something. It's not about what people want. It's about the way our rules are set up that kind of express the people's attitudes. And so that's why, again, I think it's really critical to focus on reforming our democratic institutions.
Yeah, and you really make the point that the political parties in this sense serve a really important role. That we've had demagogues in the American past. You talk about Henry Ford and Huey Long and Father Coughlin, left and right, Henry Wallace. And yet, in all of those cases, the Republican Party was able to keep them out, to guard our guardrails, to minimize the power of demagoguery. And I'm wondering then, what happened to the Republican Party that allowed a man who's clearly a demagogue, clearly for 4 years, we saw his sort of assault on democracy in so many ways that we'll get into here. What happened that allowed the Republican Party to not do its gatekeeping job in picking a responsible leader?
Yes. George Wallace. Somebody said George Wallace, not Henry Wallace. Yeah. So
I apologize. That was my mistake. Sorry.
Yeah. So no, it's your question about, how did the Republicans let Trump in the door? Unfortunately, I think that use the past tense. It's not over. I mean, because the key thing, of course, are primaries, and he made his way through the primary system. And what's happening right now, as we speak, is a lot of Republican members of Congress are sort of trying to decide how they're going to orient themselves going forward. And, I think they're nervous about being primaried in their own districts if they move away from Trump. And so, primaries continue to serve as a major constraint on the ability of the Republican Party to moderate. And so, what is that? What's the implication of that? I mean, I'm not sure if, we need to rethink the way we select our candidates. And that's another, we have a lot of things that we need to rethink. But, before 1972, when essentially primaries didn't really matter very much, it was much easier for party leaders to pick the candidates. And that maybe doesn't sound very democratic. It isn't very democratic. But on the other hand, there was much less pressure on the party, in particular the Republican Party, to move to the right. The puzzle to me about this is why we haven't had similar Biden won the presidential nomination in 2020, and Bernie Sanders was not able to break through in the same way that Trump was. And I don't know what exactly that explains that, but what's clear is that the primaries lower the threshold, make it easier for outsiders to break in. You may have your own favorite outsider, and so you may like this system, but I think anybody needs to recognize that it also opens the door and makes it easier for these kinds of figures. And no other advanced democracy in the world could Bernie Sanders, who's not a member of the Democratic Party, almost become head of the party, or Donald Trump, who was never a Republican, never held elected office, become head of the party. So we have an incredibly inclusive system through primaries, and there's other ways of selecting candidates, and I could give you a whole lecture on that.
Well, yeah, I think another big factor is the media, which is another big part of your book. And I think this is maybe a chance to bring Lowell into the conversation here. One thing that strikes me as a real game changer is the total dominance of social media. We've not figured out a way of a system of laws to have social media be accountable for what goes on to their platforms. And clearly this has raised all kinds of, articulation of polarized extremist views based on completely non-factual information. And it's really frustrating. So I guess my question here would be for Lowell. What should be done about the social media, extremist media having such a instantaneous mass outreach if we're going to save our democracy?
Okay, well, just to start, I mean, and not to seem too contrarian, democracy doesn't normally work very well, and has created all kinds of things, including Hitler was elected. So this is not new that elections are used for authoritarian leaders to come to power, which is in Daniel's book, and that the danger of what we call democracy is that it can spin out of control. That's one of if you read the Federalist Papers, I know the Constitution's short, but there's huge literature behind what went into the various aspects of it. One of which, by the way, involves journalism. Journalism is the only profession that's discussed in the Constitution, by the way, and as well as being protected and given a distribution system called the post office. So there are parts of it that are unique, parts of it that are very helpful today. But I don't think that it's that useful to debate what should be in the Constitution or how should we change the structure of the system. I think the first thing that we need to understand is that what we have been living through is a mass psychological phenomenon. I don't know how many of you people out there have relatives or friends who said to you when you talked to them about Donald Trump, they said, he says what we're thinking. He's saying what we want to say, but we can't. There's a huge repressed part of America and the consciousness of America that's out there that hasn't been talked about openly and engaged in. And so that's one of the fundamental contradictions of the whole situation. Donald Trump got 75 million votes, and there is a reason for that. The reason may not be rational, but I don't think, and particularly dealing in the world of media and how it works, that being reasonable and rational is a fundamental principle of media. There's attempts at different times to bring it under control, particularly electronic media. And I think it's important. I see pictures of people in here who are maybe old enough to remember that electronic broadcasting in the United States was regulated as to content. It was a concept that was introduced with a technology called radio. It was a new technology. It was totally wild and out of control, and anything could go on it. And people actually set up stations with broadcasting that blanketed America. It was out of control. In 1926, it was brought under control by the Secretary of Commerce under Calvin Coolidge, named Herbert Hoover. And Herbert Hoover came up with the idea that this new technology was a great potential boon to mankind. He was known himself for relief efforts and charities. And I'm just going back to that to say, here's a new technology. instant access to a mass audience. It was a recognition that it was potentially dangerous. He said that it shouldn't be exploited just for commercial use because it was making a lot of money. And he invented basically the concept of public interest as it's connected to electronic media. Now, why is that important? That definition continued for 60 years. That definition was defined so that licensees, broadcasters could get their licenses lifted. In 1931, when he was president, they lifted the first broadcasting license in America because a radio station in Los Angeles was broadcasting hate speech, backing the Ku Klux Klan, anti-Semitic, anti-Black, anti-Catholic, et cetera. And for violating the public interest, the federal courts upheld Hoover's administration lifting that license. So what I focused on in this situation that we're in is that when Donald Trump got up to join the Republican primary and was getting on the stage and then it began the attack on Megyn Kelly and all the other things that we all noticed that were so different in terms of how he characterized people, demeaning people on the air. First of all, he was violating all the regulations, all of the standards and practices that every major broadcaster has by doing that. They allowed that to happen. The other thing is, you couldn't have done that before 1985. The FCC would have lifted the license of the stations that broadcast that kind of behavior. There were plenty of precedents. They were upheld by the Supreme Court. It was lifted when the Reagan administration redefined Hoover's public interest concept as whatever the public is interested in. The next year, you got Rush Limbaugh. So briefly, all I want to just say, what's most important here is that we don't have a system of public education or a national broadcasting system, including the web, that in a sense polices what is said. Who gets access to a mass audience?
Not to mention the fairness doctrine, which Ronald Reagan also got rid of, right?
At the same time, fairness doctrine technically still existed until about 20 years ago, but they weren't enforcing it. And the right of reply is what was, if you got attacked personally in a broadcast, you could demand that the station that carried that attack give you equal time to reply. That would have made impossible what just happened. So, right. So we have to, I think, understand that we have a large portion of the population that believes things that we know are untrue. And until we have some form of public education that changes that, we're in deep trouble.
Okay, so given that, going back to the book now, it seems like the concepts of mutual toleration of political parties and institutional forbearance, where politicians don't pull out all the stops and just play what you call political hardball. It seems like they're mutually contradictory, where on the one hand, you argue in the book that Democrats probably shouldn't play the kind of hardball that Republicans have played because that's going to further polarize the country. But what is the Democrat to do, the Democratic Party? What is it to do, given, even in today's paper, we're looking at, talking about the use of the filibuster. And in the book, you seem to have a favorable view of the filibuster. How democratic and how important is the filibuster as a practice in the Senate?
He's muted, Daniel. You're muted.
It's been entirely abused. It's outlived its initial purpose, and it should be eliminated. I'm in favor of getting rid of the filibuster. And I just want to link this though to what Lowell just said, because I think it's very interesting to think about the way in which the media structures have shaped the current moment we're in. I would just add to it though that the reason these reforms took place was because of the political climate in which they were operating. There were political parties and political actors pushing for this. And I would be curious to know what Lowell thinks about how to unwind these or how to reform these kinds of media to allow for either the reinstitution of these or the renewal of institutions for a new social media age. Because I think from my view, I would expect that one of the barriers to a kind of rational attempt to deal with these major problems is the same barriers that we confront when confronting any major problem, which are the fact that we have one political party that basically doesn't accept the rules of the game, is willing to stand in the way of any kind of significant or important legislation through the filibuster. And so I think a lot of these institutional reforms at the level of, either constitutional, the filibuster is something that could be reformed tomorrow by a majority in the Senate. I mean, it's given this, how small the Democratic majority is, it's not going to disappear overnight, but it's something that's just it's not in the Constitution. It has no legal status. It's simply a rule of the Senate. It's the rule of the game, just as we have rules of the game here in this conversation. So they could get together, they could decide to eliminate it, and it requires a majority. And I think there's growing pressure to do this. And had the Democratic majority been significant enough in November, they would have really pushed much harder for it. So I think this getting rid of that kind of thing would allow for. No other country has a filibuster. No other democracy has a filibuster. I mean, there's ways of delaying debate, but nothing that's used to the degree that ours is. And so it's no surprise that we're in the situation that we're in, that you can't address these basic kinds of things like, let's figure out how to regulate speech on media and social media in a kind of reasonable way. Similarly, the Electoral College. No other country in the world has an Electoral College. There was one country that had an Electoral College, and that was Argentina. Because it copied its constitution from us, and it was not doing anything that got rid of it. And an electoral college is kind of like the human body. It's the appendix of the human body. It's like this institution in our constitution that doesn't serve any purpose, and you only notice when it explodes and destroys your system, right? So we could get rid of. But this, on the other hand, would require major constitutional changes. So to your point, though, John, is there a dilemma in terms of how hard do you fight back? In general, I think there's a cost to escalation. There's no denying that. There's a cost to escalating because this can spiral out of control. On the other hand, when you have an opposition that's abusing the rules, I don't think you stand by silently and keep taking the abuse, because that's another way to kill a political system. And so I think it's important that Democrats, fight hard, that they push to eliminate things like the filibuster. They continue to abide by democratic norms. I don't think the filibuster is necessarily abiding by democratic, keeping the filibusters abiding by democratic norms or not. It's just sort of the bad state in which we're in, is that more and more extreme measures are needed from the Democrats. And so the way that the Democrats are now going to, there's this major stimulus bill that is, totally necessary for our country and for, to restore our economy, is going to have to pass through sort of extraordinary measures. That's regretful, but it may be necessary. And if I were, advising the Biden administration, I would say to do it. But I understand that there's a cost. I think we should also recognize that this is a sign of a kind of spiraling situation.
Well, yeah, so much what you're saying reminds me of the American Academy of Arts that released, several months ago, a study called Our Common Purpose, in which they laid out 31 reforms. And just in this conversation, you have brought up, 5 or 6 or 7 of them, from just ways they vote to all kinds of things. So given this polarization, were you shocked by the violence of January 6th? And I'll just follow that up with, what shocked me even more than the violence of January 6th is what the Republican Party response has been since the violence of January 6th. It looks like they're going to vote down impeachment. Conviction on impeachment. And I'm curious what your view is on impeachment as one of these damned if you do, damned if you don't issues for the Democrats, of either, endangering democracy through political hardball and that kind of escalation, or letting the soft guardrails come off of democracy by having no accountability for horrendous lawbreaking.
So is that for me? Yeah, I don't think that I'd be curious to hear what Lowell thinks. I don't think there is a dilemma. There's no question in my mind that President Trump has earned, former President Trump has earned both impeachment and conviction. What hardball is when you use this tool for strictly political ends.
Which is my question about the Republicans. I guess my question is more about the Republicans. The party itself is so split into pro-Trump, anti-Trump factions. I'm fascinated to hear what you would think about how can so many Republican leaders still be pro-Trump? He's not even president anymore.
Right.
Because he's got people elected, because he has a mass following. And that mass following believes things and acts in ways that do not fit into the regular procedure that you're used to within an electoral process in the United States. We've got a mass psychological phenomenon here that we need to agree exists and needs to be dealt with in a constructive way. The way it's going these days is that the media organizations will go where the profits are. That's what happened in the Trump election in 2016. Their ratings went way up, particularly every news division and every cable station that's around. They made tons of money. They gave him over $2 billion in free advertising. He played that game, and they're addicted to putting him on, and their ratings will go down if he's not around. So there's a whole cycle going on here. The Facebook, Twitter, and everybody clamping down on Trump happened at the very end. Now he's a martyr, and his followers are still there, and they're looking at themselves as being ignored. So I think that unless we step back and try and have a better understanding of why people act the way they do and how they can be manipulated, it doesn't really matter which way we go in many ways. I mean, of course, and by the way, in the book yourself, you lay out at the end, there is no democracy that has survived the diversity that exists in the United States today. So we're asking our society to do something unprecedented. And I still don't see myself in the overall discussion and analysis in the news media and elsewhere, a way of reaching out and making this work without a lot more violence. I mean, I don't want to sound prescient, but 9 months ago, I gave a talk in which I said, there's no way Trump's leaving office without blood on the streets. And that has already happened. And I think that we do not know how deeply his followers have, if you will, are in the ranks, for instance, of certain federal law enforcement agencies, as well as local law enforcement, as well as the military. So we have to look at this realistically, I think, and it's a very difficult problem. It's a very difficult situation. One of the most promising things that I've heard the other day was when Biden was talking about his energy policy, that he is going to directly address the people of West Virginia, basically, coal miners and so on. People want to know in those communities, what's in it for us? How are we going to survive this tremendous change that's going on? And I think that's a fundamental question here. And we could debate whether the Republicans are responsible or irresponsible. They're politicians, they want to get reelected. And right now, getting reelected for them means sticking with Donald Trump.
Yeah.
Or his successor.
So I would just say that there's two ways we're not the first country nor the first generation to deal with the presence of an anti-system party that is one that doesn't accept the rules of the games, is willing to tolerate violence. And there's been other countries, other societies, other generations that have had to deal with this. And there's generally two solutions. One is a solution that Germany adopted after 1945, which is, they included into their constitution, they developed a new conception of democracy called militant democracy. That's the English title of it. And it essentially means in the Constitution, there's a clause of the Constitution that allows for political parties, but there's a clause of the Constitution that also says under certain conditions, if a political party behaves in ways that are opposed to the constitutional order, they can be banned. Free speech, of course, important in a liberal democracy. Another article of the Constitution says, but if people use free speech irresponsibly, that is like wave swastikas in Germany, publish Mein Kampf, you can be punished for this and your speech can be banned. So, Germany's a liberal democracy, but it has these constraints. So that's one way of dealing with it. One question would be, do we want that? I don't know. My sense is that's probably, we may not be on the path to that. We can, our constitutional structure doesn't allow for that. That's one solution. I'd be interested to hear what Lowell thinks about the role of free speech.
Wait a second. The Constitution allows limitation of speech. That people don't talk about it, but they do. You cannot advertise for cigarettes, for nicotine addiction, basically, on electronic broadcasting. That happened in 1970, okay? You can't do it. There's certain kinds of speech that are banned, and there's tons of self-censorship that goes on within news organizations as well. There's certain kinds of stories that are more difficult to do than others and get them published. We've always had limitations. When we go to war, you didn't see people, first of all, I mean, it's kind of insane to me that we have an electoral system where a candidate can get up and say, I'm going to get elected, I'm going to win this election, and if I don't, it's rigged. And I won't say out loud that I'll accept the consequences, right? But I want you to vote for me. That's enabling somebody to disrupt the whole system. Right there.
Yeah, and what I'm saying in contemporary Germany, if a politician said, I'm not going to accept the results of the election, if there was politicians in the floor of the parliament carrying guns, threatening politicians as some new members of Congress, an investigation would be open. The equivalent of the FBI would investigate them. And, and only two parties have actually been banned in post-war Germany, the Communist Party and the kind of neo-Nazi party in the 1950s. But this shadow and the threat of it and the investigations that take place are a constraint, because people don't like to be banned, and so they limit what they say. And now there's a big debate about this, because there's a lot of Germans who say, well, this is outrageous. We need to have, because then the other model so that's one model. The other model is the kind of classic model of like the free marketplace of ideas, let anything go. And I guess, the sense is that that's not really, I mean, there's always restrictions, I guess, is what you're saying, Lowell. And even that model, in the places that it's supposed to work, it doesn't exist.
Until 1985 in the United States, and I'm not talking about printing things or reading or getting up on a street corner, but when you use the public airwaves, and by the way, people are not told that the taxpayers own cyberspace. They own the web. It was created by US tax money. And the only reason it's not regulated as to content is legislation on one hand, and one Supreme Court decision in 1997 when it was a dial-up system. Since then, there's been no major legislation or Supreme Court decision to define whether it can be regulated or not. It can be. Just before, when people raise this issue, if you go online and go to Google and just Google in Europe or Google trust and security, inside Google, they have a whole department of thousands of people who are making sure that Google's content matches the standards that the EU wants for content. There's no hate speech. They police it themselves with oversight of the governments. It's done. It could be done here. It's that we don't do it. There's a mythology that pure tolerance is what we should have in our society, and when we don't really have it.
Yeah.
I studied with 3 German expatriate professors in the 60s, and one of them wrote an essay called The Critique of Pure Tolerance. He got denounced by all of academia by writing that. What he wanted to do, he wanted to say, the lesson we learned is you can't have anti-Semitism, racism, and hate speech in the media in your country if you want to survive. It's a lesson that's been learned many other places.
So Daniel, with all that's happened since your book was written, I guess almost 2 years ago, I guess it was written right around the middle of the Trump presidency. Since then, you've seen the impeachments, you've seen the violence, you've seen the inauguration of the new president. Would you add anything to your book after what's happened? Do you feel like anything you said? I mean, I feel like so much of what you said was so spot on. It was almost prophetic. Writing just before it, you could see it coming out. Did anything, I guess, surprise you, or would you change or add anything given the most recent volatility and turbulence?
I guess maybe like lots of people, as much as I thought that the Republican Party was, caved into Trump, I thought that there would be more resistance at the point of like violence and, outright sedition and so on. I mean, I kind of didn't, I expected that there would be some like better angels, so that's, I guess that I expected that. I mean, I continue to expect that, I guess, that the party would be split on this kind of thing, but
How do you explain that?
Yeah, so why aren't they? Well, I think as a political scientist, I think a lot of it is driven by electoral self-interest. I think people are opportunistic, and they want to gain office. I mean, this is, so I was on a panel the other day with a conservative Republican, not a politician, but a guy who's very close to lots of politicians. And he was almost like begging for empathy, like, oh, it's so hard being a Republican. You have these Nazis who are associated with you and they're put in this tough bind. What should they do? So I feel like that Republican members of Congress and the Senate like really feel like that they have been in, and I think it's a kind of myth that people in these positions often tell themselves, as if with people in the Trump administration who have this kind of sense that, oh, I'm playing this heroic role by sticking around, I'm constraining the president. I think there's probably Republican members of the Congress and Senate who think if I leave, things will even get worse. And it's a great story to tell yourself because you get to enjoy the perks of power in the meantime. And what in my response to him the other day is what I'll say right now, which is that this is the same thing that conservative politicians said in 1933 in Germany. I mean, this is people face difficult choices in office, and you have to, at the end of the day, draw a hard line and do the right thing. And there's many politicians isn't the only profession that have been challenged. Military officers, journalists, bureaucrats, civil servants, scientists under incredible pressure to toe the line. And many people have done the right thing. And so I think it is possible for people to do the right thing. So it's maybe not enough to just say it's about personal courage, but I think that's a big part of it. And, because people under threat have been willing to take the risk. That's not that points to the problem. That doesn't provide a solution though. I mean, because it's not going to help to have us sitting here wagging our finger at people and say, oh, you have to behave better. You have to, I think we have to appeal to people's self-interest. And so again, I know I'm like a broken record here, but the way people's self-interest, I mean, there's going to be white nationalists. There's going to be these kinds of crazy elements in our society, and they've always been there. I mean, it's been heightened under Trump, but I think the most dangerous thing is that our political leaders are attaching themselves to those people. I mean, it's one thing to have white nationalists, Timothy McVeigh, running around. These guys have been there, for 150 years, going back to the know nothings, right? The thing is, why do politicians think it's in their electoral interest to connect themselves? And that's the link that needs to be severed. And I think that's what you have to change the rules. I mean, I believe in incentives in a way. I mean, if you change the rules, I think there's a way. If Republicans needed to win, let's say you had statewide elections for California, just for example, for Congress. If Kevin McCarthy needed to win votes in San Francisco in order to be in Congress, he couldn't toe the line that he's doing. So if you drew boundaries in a different way, I understand that's not feasible, but if you drew boundaries in a different way, you suddenly would have different behavior, or they would drop out of the game, or you'd get different people.
And it goes back to that one party, one single member districts. Riley, I think we're in our last couple of minutes. Did you want to ask anything to wrap up from the chat or anything like that?
Well, I do want to say, I want to thank you guys for, what I knew was going to be an incredible, engaged conversation, provocative, I guess. Before I pass it to Nancy to help us wrap up and summarize where we are, bring it back down to a Sonoma County perspective in a bit. I see a dilemma. I had a son who was born in 1984, and that was chilling to me that I was bringing a new life into the world in George Orwell's 1984. And I mean, it gave great pause, and I stopped and thought quite a bit about, what am I doing to this child? What kind of a world am I bringing him into? And look, he's 37 years old now. And I didn't predict the specificity of what we're facing, but it is, it is that set of challenges, that societal breakdown, the racism that still exists, et cetera. I thought that's what I was bringing him into, and here he is, and he's dealing with it. He's a good, strong kid. He was a student of Mr. Grech, so he's going to be all right. But now my concern, or even close to my fear, is the children we're bearing today that are being born, and the young children that have to go the next 37 years and face what we're faced with. We have to keep these great lessons going forward, and the challenges of 1984 to 2021 are just exponentially more challenging, institutionally, culturally, societal. I think Daniel, you're right. We're having some better discussions around our racial grievances in this country. We're addressing social media influences and how we don't want to be so controlled by that. But we've got to do our homework, and we've got to adhere to. Here you go, Nancy. We've got to adhere to the mission and value statements that in organizations, institutions like the Local News Initiative is trying to launch and is working on. And there's thousands of them. They're small and they're blooming, but sustaining journalism at the very local level is absolutely essential. If you don't have that, you don't have a democracy. If we don't promote civic engagement and do more of these kinds of discussions and talks, and get our head around media literacy and how we're being abused, and we're laboratory rats that work for Google and Facebook. That's what they look at us as. And Nancy's and the Local News Initiative is going to solve all that for us, right, Nancy?
I would just throw in that my experience with
great.
Students today, I would say, are very media savvy, a lot more media savvy than I was when I was a kid. And I'm impressed with young people. I'm optimistic that young people are going to see through this and bring us in a much more positive, less polarized direction. I'm confident of that just from my time with my students. I'll turn it over to you, Nancy, to wrap.
John, thanks. And it's good to hear your positive outlook, since you are dealing with the young people so much more closely than we are. And we at the Sonoma County Local News Initiative also have a very, very positive outlook. We feel that what we can do in terms of help sustaining, as Raleigh said, not only local journalism, but community engagement, local journalism that supports community engagement and involvement, and media literacy are the three issues that we really have to focus on. And Raleigh is also absolutely right in that we're one of a number of other kind of petri dishes around the country, trying to figure out how to make this work. So we may think, oh, we're just talking about the Healdsburg Tribune or the Sebastopol Times. We're talking about media across the country. And that's the way it works in this country, little bit. And then we all start talking to each other and we figure out what worked here and what works in Poughkeepsie and what works in Wichita. So that's what we're about at the Sonoma County Local News Initiative. Your support, folks, is really critical. That's what it takes. It takes a community. It really does. If you want to buy Daniel's book, again, it's available at Levin & Company or at the Sonoma County Library. Also, the presentation today has been recorded and it's archived at the Healdsburg Tribune YouTube site or at their Facebook page. And our next adventure in this series will be on March 18th at 5 o'clock. That's the what's known in the media as the Sunshine Week. It's the week of James Madison's birthday. Now you have to go look that up in an encyclopedia, not on Google. and find out why James Madison is important to media. It'll be, again, Lowell would be joining us along with Seth Rosenfeld and also Thomas Peele. That's 3 Pulitzer Prize winners in one session. Again, March 18th at 5 o'clock. So keep your eye out and we'll let you know about it. Again, SoCo Local